Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of FinServ Tech Oracles. And here we are, your oracular colleagues, Jerry Murphy and myself, to talk about the people using all this technology in financial services. And Jerry, I know this is a favorite topic of yours. You've had lots of experience being on both sides of IT,
Yes.
providing it, doing it in the financial services industry, and your actual career specialty is working in IT infrastructure across the spectrum of industries. So tell us, how is financial services different, given that infrastructure ought to be the same across the board?
Well, infrastructure is largely the same, but there is a key difference, I think, in terms of the atmosphere and the attitudes of people, my experience in financial services. And I think specific, and you could probably make a difference between banking versus some other types of financial services. But one thing I find, especially in the banking side, is they tend to be towards people doing work versus automation or technology doing work. Historically, it's a very people centric basis, and they certainly need to use technology, and they do use technology, but they tend to prefer to lean on people to do things versus technology to do things. The second thing I would say is they tend to have a risk averse mindset. Part of that is just because they're dealing with lots of money and they tend to be very risk averse. Secondly, they're highly regulated entities, which also tends to make them, uh, when in doubt, don't do something, tends to be the attitude. The other thing from a personality standpoint is, especially on the banking side, is people really stay in place. When you go to some of these banking environments, it's amazing to find, even though the smaller banks, especially, they don't tend to get paid fantastically well, but they'll stay in place for, 15, 20, 30 years. They tend not to move around. The attitude tends to be very slow to hire and also very slow to fire. And I think that gives you a different type of personality of person and how they approach operations and how they approach using technology.
So it's more people centric from an infrastructure perspective. You
Yeah.
you tend to be a little more automation averse and have more people, generally be risk averse and have longer tenure. And I can certainly agree. I know we've worked with a number of insurance companies, for example, where the median, I want to say the median, half above, half below tenure was like 20 years. And you had
Yeah.
people staying on 35, 40 years and in infrastructure at the same job, which means they've seen 15 major technology shifts. So they've gone from mainframes to client server to LAN to internet to cloud to virtual, and somehow they're still there.
But I will say, you make an interesting point. Very often, but when you find that changing of technology, very often it's thrust on them as opposed to the people there have embraced it. Because very often in these places, you're not always having the people that went to MIT to study quantum cryptography are not the people who are tending to work at those places necessarily. And so very often it's like they'll take some technology, and once they learn it, they don't want to change. And then, but because they've been there for, 20, 30 years, they have changed. But again, not because they said, oh, I see this new thing, I'm going to adopt it. It's more like, oh crap, this other thing is no longer working. So now I finally have to adopt this new technology.
Well, I would just put the caveat once again that largely when you say financial services, you're thinking about community banks, consumer banks, smaller
Yes.
banks. Certainly the people at
That is not the
Fidelity
case
and
for the
Goldman,
Fidelities and the
yeah,
Goldman Sachses of the
and
world.
anybody who's in a hedge fund or a private equity firm is probably listening to this, going, "Are you people completely nuts?"
Right.
In fact, I did get a PhD from MIT in quantum cryptography. Why
Yes.
do you think I took this job?
Yeah.
Right,
Yep. Yep. Yep.
so given that caveat, what would you recommend for sort of your more typical financial services firm? What are some things they can do, practices they could adopt from other industries to make themselves more effective?
Well, there's a few things I think they can do. First is, do look at new technology. Don't be so risk averse. Yes, you have to comply with regulations and follow rules, but it would behoove them to actually look at technology, see what other people are doing with technology, see how other people are using it, and don't be afraid of looking at the new technology because you are going to be using it instead of avoiding it. Understand what you can use and how you can benefit would be one thing. The second thing I would say is spend more time talking with business people.
Yeah.
It's one thing to know a specific technology and how to use it, but I think they would be more effective if they spent time talking with, you know, the loan officers, the salespeople, the people who are using technology to find out what do they like about technology, what do they not like about technology, what are
And
the
and also
problems
just
and
plain the
challenges.
also just plain the usage patterns. I
Yes,
mean,
exactly.
gosh, why is it that, every Thursday at 2 p.m. we get this massive spike in data transfer? What's going on? What's driving that? Because again, your infrastructure, you may not be touching those users, but understanding how they think and what they're doing and what their patterns are is helpful.
Yes. And then the last thing I would say is try not to live so much in silos. I think in almost any business, the human tendency is to live in silos. That really happens in banking, especially. It's like I become really good at my little niche thing, and then I'm good at that, and I don't interact with the rest of the world. You need to interact with the rest of the world. Systems are getting more complicated, especially when you look at security, right? The security challenges are just getting harder and harder. And the best way to prepare for those kind of challenges is working with other people because when you have a problem, it may exhibit itself in multiple domains. And the best way you're going to get on top of these types of issues is, for networking people, talking with server people and storage people, talking with the help desk people, talking with the networking people. The more that they can communicate with each other, uh, the better you'll understand how the different pieces interoperate, and the less you'll be taken by surprise when some issue comes up. You can see some anomalous behavior that you're sharing with somebody else. They can say, "Oh, hey, I saw something weird too," and it's easier to put those kind of issues together when you're talking with one another instead of
And
just
and
doing
and
your
I
own
would
thing.
also say you've really put your thumb on the pulse here, finger, I guess, because if you put your thumb, you will pick up the pulse in your thumb. But your finger on the pulse of a critical area for financial services firms, because of course, for any bank, security is absolutely essential, and it's critical that the security folks stay on top of all the new technologies and understand all the other domains so that they can understand how their security technologies will affect and interact with other technologies. And yet it's also the area where I think a lot of banks don't spend enough time because they're more worried when it comes right down to it. They're more worried about fraud detection and prevention than actual cybersecurity. And
Yes.
the sad news is they need to concern themselves with both.
Right. And I think what we've often found is, especially when we're doing things like, incident response planning exercises, the biggest challenge usually isn't that any individual technologist doesn't understand what their job is and how they configure a firewall, how they set a network setting, how they back up a server. It's really sharing that information laterally with their peers, um, tends to be where the breakdowns happen. It's like they may have uh, processes established for making sure you talk to people, but do they do it in practice? Not so much.
Exactly. So that will be the topic for an upcoming episode. That is it in terms of what we've got right now. And Jerry, thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for joining us at our Financial Services Tech Oracles, which is, as always, at 0900 right before the markets open on Tuesday. Thank you much.